In this next segment, we're going to be stitching the 4 gardens to the right side of the short hedge. The first one is in the background. It uses a slanted Goblin stitch like we've done before. Again, you want to use a long thread. The thread I used was about 30 inches long because I didn't want to start and stop my long stitch in this area, even though it's a small one. And I divided this area into a top and lower area for the 18 count canvas, but I chose not to divide it for linen and Congress cloth because the fabric teeth show. I didn't think it had a good appearance. The garden on the left, which is in the upper middle area, first uses a basket weave base. The thread I used was an over dye, so this was an opportunity again to change the direction of one of the strands to smooth out the color of the over dye. And even so, I did get a little bit of striping. But I'm going to place French knots on top of this basket weave base. I'm going to scatter small French knots in this garden, and I want to show you how to do a French knot. Just let me bring it up above my garden area. I bring the thread straight down, place the needle on top of my thread, wrap it counterclockwise 1 time around the needle, and then as I place my needle in my fabric, slide the loop down to the fabric and pull my thread through the knot, leaving a little bit of a top knot on top of the fabric. I don't want to pull too tightly or I'll lose that little top knot. So let me do it again. I place the needle over the thread, wrap the thread counterclockwise 1 time around the needle. When I place my needle in my fabric, slide the loops down to the fabric, and as I pull my thread through, don't pull too tightly to leave a little bit of a top knot in my French knot. So as I take my needle down, I might take it over a fabric thread to the right or straight up or to the left for movement. So let me place a few now on my stitch basket weave base. You have some options. You can make some decisions here for yourself. Any of them will work. You can place some in the background area that are in a solid color, perhaps your lighter color. You want to just scatter your French knots over this area. You might decide to put them only in the foreground of this little area, giving a little bit of a sense of depth. You might also decide to change one of the strands from the solid color or the lighter color, put in a darker color, one strand of dark color along with the lighter ones as you scatter. You also might decide to put a lot of French knots in the foreground and less in the background, creating a little bit of density in the foreground of this area. So we're getting a little bit of texture, a little bit of dimension, because this garden is beginning to move into the middle of our piece toward the foreground. Now, you don't want to put any of your French knots within 1/4 inch of your left-hand design line because your mat is going to go over that. You don't want any dimension underneath your framing mat. The garden that's labeled G3 in the lower middle right is going to be done in 2 steps. First, we're going to do the diagonal Romanian stitched pattern in thread. And then we're going to put beads over that area, and in this chart those beads are represented by the little gray circles. The open diagonal Romanian stitch is located just below your pink basket weave area. The first stitch goes over 3 canvas threads, and then there is a cross stitch that goes across the middle over 1 thread. I'm coming down on the diagonal, skipping a channel. Again, that long stitch goes over 3 canvas threads and the short cross over 1 canvas thread. Again, I'm skipping a channel and coming down on the diagonal. That openness is what gives it a lacy feel and why we call it an open diagonal Romanian stitch. Because sometimes that space doesn't exist and it would just be a Romanian stitch. So now I'm against my design line and I'll do the last of my short crosses across the middle of my long stitch. Now, coming up now in my next row, I'm going to count down 1 canvas thread and over 3. Again, my stitch is going to go over 3 canvas threads. Fits right between the prior 2 stitches, but now my cross stitch is going to go in an upward position. And again, on the diagonal, a long stitch over 3, and my short cross stitch over the middle in an upward direction, going over 1 canvas thread. So to place the beads on my stitched area, I put them somewhere where they're not going to roll away from me. I've just put them on a blue cloth here. And then I like to put them on the sticky side of a notepad. And I can hold that to get a bead without them rolling away from me. So I've brought up my thread on my beading needle, and I can just take one of those beads easily off that piece of paper, and I place my bead between the cross stitches, and I want to go through that bead twice to anchor it in place. So I'm using a white thread, which might be hard for you to see, but it matches the color of my bead. And as I do these cross stitches, get my next one here, there we go, bring up my beading needle. Again, I can just pick up that little sticky paper, get a bead on my needle, take my thread through the bead one time, bring it up in the same fabric holes, and go through it a second time. All the beads are going to line up in the same direction. Just be careful because you have French knots right above this area that when you're angling your beading needle, or if you're using the larger size bead, you can use your number 8 tapestry needle. You want to be sure not to snag the threads of those little French knots or any of the stitching in the adjacent areas. And again, kind of pull that little bead out of the way to bring my needle up for the second stitch that's going to go through it. And continue for the entire design area except 1/4 inch close to the design line on the far left, because again, that's where your framing mat is going to go, and you don't want to have any dimension underneath your framing mat. Okay. The lower right garden on the left side of our hedge is done using 3 different stitches. First, we do a long cross stitch, then a horizontal bar, and this is followed by placing a little yellow tulip on top. So I want to demonstrate the long cross stitch. I've taken a couple here in my design area. I'm going to count up 4 threads, and to the right 2 threads, and then I do my cross stitch. I'm going to skip over 2 threads, leaving an exposed fabric channel for my next cross stitch. I want to be sure that all the stitches of my cross stitch go in the same direction. So I would do this all the way across the design area for my top row, and then I'm going to drop down to do my next row. And I want to show you how these long crosses fit in to those just above. Again, I'm going over 4 threads and over 2, but my long cross stitches are just down 2 threads from my first row above and fitting right into the middle of the row above. This is going to happen with every row. So once you've done your cross stitches, and let's just assume that I've done them all, what you want to do is a horizontal bar, or I'll do one more. You want to do a horizontal bar that goes across the top and the bottom of all of the cross stitches. So I would be doing it right across the top, one side to the other. Let me just do one to show you. I can do this almost as though I'm doing a darning pattern straight across all of the cross stitches. So again, the top and the bottom of all of the cross stitches for that little horizontal bar. Okay? So now that my long crosses and my horizontal bars have been stitched, you're going to notice at the top of this stitch pattern that there's a lot of exposed canvas between the long crosses. So what I did was the bottom half of a cross stitch between the long crosses to fill in that exposed canvas. And I did this at both the top of the design and also at the bottom design line. So once this area is stitched, you see that there are a lot of holes, exposed canvas showing. And it gives us a good place to put a little tulip stitch right on top. So I have brought 2 long crosses here to the side so that you can see the placement of this tulip stitch a little bit more clearly. I'm going to bring my needle up right under the point where the threads of the long cross go over each other, here in the center of the long cross. That's the top of my stitch, my center stitch for the tulip. Now I'm going to bring it down and go just under that crossover of stitches of the stitch below. And that's going to be the center stitch of my tulip. And then for the side stitches, I come up on one side of the horizontal bar that goes between those long crosses for one side of the little tulip, and then on the other side of that horizontal bar, back down into the same hole. It's like a little eyelet, creates just a little flower pattern that I've called a tulip. I'm going to do this every several cross stitches, and you can follow the chart for the placement of the little tulip flowers in the way that I did them.